Welcome back to the Remote Access Redefined podcast. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia from Conversational Geek. This is the second episode of the podcast's second season. Now, over the course of the podcast's first season, we discussed all the important aspects of OEM and SDK remote access integration points. You can check it out in its entirety on realvnc.com/podcast and, of course, on all major podcast platforms. Now, this second season, we're taking a comprehensive look at the remote access solution landscape from the perspective of RealVNC, the inventors of VNC technology. One of the most important aspects of any remote access solution, of course, is its security. And that's something you should need to sacrifice for the sake of convenience. And with that said, though, a lot of organizations are still using RDP. That's, of course, Microsoft's remote desktop protocol for their remote access needs, whether it's for cost or convenience reasons. And so in this second episode, we're going to discuss why this is a dangerous practice and why a secure remote access solution should be the way to go. Now, joining me as always for this episode and all the ones before it is Dom Parkes. Dom is the lead developer for OEM at RealVNC. Dom, thanks once again for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Good to see you again.
You as well. And as always, just in case somebody hasn't listened to any of the previous episodes before we start, could you briefly introduce yourself and just talk a little bit about what you do at RealVNC?
Yeah, so as you said, I'm the lead developer on our OEM team. So I look after the technical team who are kind of charged with getting real VNC technology into our partners' solutions, hardware, software, anywhere it's needed, really.
Excellent. Glad to have you as always. You're obviously the right guy for this. We've been doing this a number of episodes now. And what we're going to talk about today, we'll start with just talking about the current threat landscape a little bit. So we just dive right into thinking about security. We can, of course, apply it to remote access. We can do that a little later on as well. But when we think about the current threat landscape, how have you seen it evolve over the last couple of years?
So yeah, a couple of years is a short time frame. I think I've seen it evolve massively over the last, say, 20 years. And I think that's kind of peaking now, and the speed of change is really accelerating, if anything. But I think if we take a slightly longer view of like 10 years, we've seen a definite move from kind of disorganized to organized, much more prevalence of state actors. They've probably always been there, but the sophistication level is getting much higher across all these groups. So I think what we're seeing is kind of output of what's been planned and been going on, been built up over many years of supply chain attacks, embedding vulnerabilities into things, into open source projects and things like that, embedding backdoors into those projects. And then recently we had the browser extension attack. So I think those things, these really long-term resident attacks, that stuff's becoming much more obvious now. And what's really driven all of this is much more automation, much more tools, hacking tools as services being provided. And then the really recent stuff is that AI is growing in terms of its ability to create much more realistic phishing attacks, and actually being used to directly, orchestrate attacks itself. So, it has the ability to act as an agent and to see where, vulnerabilities are. So I think that kind of rise of automation over the last few years in particular, and the kind of rapid exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities as a result, have meant that, you can't wait on these things to be revealed. You have to have some kind of plan to deal with things. You can't wait for people to fix vulnerabilities out there and publish them, and it can be way too late by that point. So I think those are the things that have really changed, in the last couple of years.
Yeah, we've seen, you mentioned supply chain attacks. That's been a huge growth in the last number of years.
Yeah.
Threat actors and threat groups are realizing the value there. Particularly, kind of goes back to the last thing you talked about, vulnerabilities. Maybe there's a vulnerability in a vendor that everyone uses, and then we can use that as an entree to get into a network and so on. And also the use of AI. It becomes really interesting because most of the cyber attacks, it started off, of course, being a threat actor themselves, crouched over, hunched over their desk at 3 a.m. with a hoodie on, so to speak. And then it became all scripting, and scripting was simply automating. And then AI, the best example of AI's use in its most advanced, if you will, is the recent attack stopped by Anthropic, where someone was using Claude,
Mhm.
and Anthropic actually estimated that in that cyber attack, 80 to 90% of the tasks that were being performed as part of the attack um, were done completely autonomously by AI. So the decisions were being made. What's the next step? How should I do it? All that, as opposed to it being a script. And I mean, I've even
Yeah,
seen, like, even maybe a year or two ago, scripts that were running, but they would go back and they would check with AI and go, "Hey, I found this. What should I do next?" And then, of
yeah,
course, the script has the script. So it's definitely advancing.
yeah,
On the threat landscape with remote access, though, I found it interesting. Just prior to the pandemic, I remember looking at a bunch of industry data and remote access being externally accessible specifically, which obviously is an initial attack vector for threat actors these days still. But it was just dying the horrible death it deserved. It was almost dead. Like most organizations, like 85% of organizations weren't using it, kind of a thing. And then the pandemic happened where everybody needed remote access. And
yeah.
then it just was revived, and it's ridiculous. Couple of interesting stats that I found of late. There's an organization called Coveware, and they do ransomware response. So they're the ones that will like interact with the ransomware threat actors and negotiate and things like that with them. And every quarter they put out a quarterly ransomware report. And one of the things here is they always show in their reports this same chart that gets updated every quarter. And typically the battle for first place for initial attack vector for ransomware attacks has been somewhere between phishing and remote access compromise. And for the last number of quarters, it was actually up to unknown was coming into play, as was supply chain, as was vulnerabilities, and so on. But then this past quarter, the report came out in October. They haven't done one. The next one will be in January, coming up next year. But remote access compromise is now like jumped up to 60% of the ransomware attacks that they saw. So there's a significant jump. That's just one quarter, but it's a massive jump, because typically the vying for first place was like, I'm a couple of points higher than you, and then you were a couple of points higher than me when you're thinking about, let's say, phishing and remote access compromise going back and forth, vying for first place, so to speak. And one of the other things they show is they show a couple of different MITRE ATT&CK framework um, tactics that are used. Excuse me. Yeah, I guess it is tactics. Yes, and one of them is lateral movement. And lateral movement could be done without a remote access solution, but it's typically not done. It's done with some kind of remote access solution. And there's a lot of instances where third party solutions, even Microsoft solution, is being used, and so on. And this quarter, 72% of the ransomware attacks still included lateral movement. So, when we think about the threat landscape, and something like even the discussion today about RDP, and thinking about RDP has been around since, like the 2000, and I want to say it's like 2004 or something like that, when they came out with it. It wasn't initially in Windows 2000. It came out after that. Might have been a couple years later. But that's old news. But the thing is, still gets used today. I
Yeah,
mean, you see the same thing with customers. They're concerned about it from that perspective.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the fact that RDP is there, it's resident, it's available. It means it's easy that it gets turned on. It's easy to exploit in that way, because someone's bound to be using it internally. They might even be aware of the fact that you don't keep that open on the internet. You don't keep that as something that people can jump into. But once they're in, it's there, and it's something that people can spin up, unless it's been configured correctly or disabled entirely. Um, but yeah, I think the sort of the things that we see in general, the sort of high level, there are kind of categories of concerns. There's things like, is the authentication secure? Because that's the legacy issue of remote access. It's like most of them, and VNC included, the authentication wasn't great. We had very limited password support, and and you had to have ports open to the internet. And so they're concerned about those sorts of things. Do we have to open this particular port? Do we have to think about how we secure these devices when there's an 8-character password limit, or and no encryption. In the old days, there was no encryption at all. So those are the old, legacy concerns, I could call them. But the new concerns are things like, can I audit what's happened? Can I react to stuff that's going on in real time? Is it compliant with what my industry requires in terms of security and regulation? So I think things are changing, and whilst the attacks are getting more sophisticated, hopefully the people using the software for the right purposes are also getting more sophisticated
Yeah, I
and
think
more
one of
demanding.
the biggest concerns, it's not a concern that like they can't be met by a remote access solution, but the biggest concern from a security standpoint with any remote access solution, whether it's being built from an SDK or it's being used off the shelf or it's whatever the case is you kind of touched on it, and that's usually around authentication and credentials, and that is one of the big ones, just because
Yeah.
The big issues today, of course, is the user of a credential, the owner of a credential, and if it's not, then it's potentially a threat actor, or it's someone else is misusing it, or whatever the case is. And so that is a challenge, not one that can't be overcome by probably just about any remote access solution, but certainly is the one that's like, is authentication secure? Is it validated? Are we making sure that it is, again, the owner of the credential and so on? Does it integrate with existing identity providers and
Yeah.
so on? Would you agree?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's this whole sort of industry that's grown up around this, like zero trust. The credentials are associated with person, they're associated with permissions, time-based access, things that can be disabled immediately from a remote source, maybe even from an AI overseer that's saying, this person's doing something weird. So all piled into a seam, and for event management.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, definitely, it stems from these credentials belong to this person, and maybe there's extra evidence when you log in that you are this person, like a second factor or whatever multi-factor authentication you can add in there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, definitely.
And just when you're talking to RealVNC customers, what's some of their common security concerns they have when it comes to remote access?
I think it's kind of what I said before about the legacy concerns and the new concerns. So yeah, whether the session is end-to-end encrypted, whether the authentication is secure, and whether the ports need to be open to the internet. And nowadays, when they come to these solutions, they want to see that they can audit what's been going on and proactively step in when something's going wrong. And more zero trust type use cases are coming up. So the ability to lock down users' permissions to particular use cases and particular roles, um, and to time bound access and things like that.
Yeah, I also think it's worth having just a brief mention of another concern would just be the down the path of like the supply chain attacks, is the idea that companies that are looking for a remote access solution are going to be wanting to know that the solution itself is secure. We talked about vulnerabilities
Yeah,
early on. You mentioned that. And knowing that there's at least an effort put in, not just to make a solution that provides remote access, and it happens to have security features, but to make sure that that solution itself is secure. Would you agree?
yeah. You need to make sure that you've figured out your entire supply chain of whatever remote access solution is being provided. You need to make sure that they have the right approach to security and the development lifecycle, so a secure development lifecycle. And yeah, the sorts of uh, accreditation and penetration testing and uh, things like auditing of internal systems and internal practices are kind of vital in any solution of this sort, because you're giving people the keys to um, everything potentially if you choose a compromised solution.
Mm-hmm. And then, do you think that customer needs have changed in response to the growing sophistication in cyber attacks, the use of AI, and so on? Has their need from a remote access solution and maybe even a need for a remote access solution changed over the last, let's say we talked about 10 years. Let's keep that time frame.
Yeah. Hopefully, like I said, hopefully they're getting more as the threat becomes more sophisticated. Hopefully the customers are too, and the users of the technology are becoming aware. If not through actually suffering attacks, they're reading about them, so they're aware of what's possible, and they're demanding stuff like we need real time monitoring and threat detection. We need to be able to track behavior of incoming agents, whether it's via the solution we've paid for or something else, so they can do sort of isolation of whatever concerning stuff might be going on. Because, yeah, you're not with the use of AI, as we mentioned at the beginning. There's the sort of reliance on known vulnerabilities isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to actually track the behavior, because the AI agents may well be finding new vulnerabilities that we haven't even thought of yet, and threat actors themselves may be finding these things too before they're disclosed. So yeah, all that stuff, you want everything that is happening in your network to be integrated into a kind of a SIEM, a security information and event management system that can react in real time to stuff like this and really shut it down.
You heard my stats from Coveware talking about remote access compromise being in 60% of this last quarter's attacks as the initial attack vector, and then
Yeah.
72% of those accounts, attacks also involving lateral movement, which implies there's some use of remote access probably somewhere in there, although that's I'm inferring for sure. But why do you think remote access tools are just such a common target for attackers? I've got my own opinion, but I want to hear yours first.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are probably multiple aspects to it, but the key thing is it's a really rich interface to a device. So it's tempting in those terms. So hopefully, and this may be another reason, hopefully they're mostly secure in the world these days. Most remote access solutions are at least somewhat secure. But that's clearly not 100% the case if they're used so prevalently in these attacks. But even if they were secure, even if they are, you know, um, fairly well locked down, they're still a really tempting target, because as soon as you've got access to something like that, you have access to a desktop. You probably have some level of elevated access to that desktop as well, and you may well have, like you say, the ability to figure out exactly what known jumping off points there are between devices, because you've accessed it via a particular remote access solution. Good chance there's going to be more of those installed around the LAN or the wider network inside the company that you've managed to get into. And I guess going back to the kind of not secure side, they can be configured poorly. There's a lot of scope out there with some solutions to install them, do the wrong thing, misconfigure something, and you end up allowing a kind of privileged access to your network by default, which, yeah, that's probably part of it.
Yeah, that's actually some good points. I always find it to be pretty simple. It's the ease of functionality and use, right?
Yeah.
It's built into every Windows machine.
Yep.
Not necessarily, but it can be. Depends on how organizations image and push out desktops and whatnot and servers. But then I think you hit the last one is really good. This idea of is if I can connect to it, I can log on. I have whatever kind of level of
Yeah.
privilege that account has. Period. Okay, that's kind of a good thing. So the prevalence of it, the privilege that it provides, and then the last part is just that it's very easy to use.
Yeah.
And because it exists, it's just I can quickly use it. I know what I can do with it. There's no question. And I should actually mention here just a technical note for those of you that are listening. When we're talking about RDP, we're not talking about remote desktop services, which is a little bit more advanced with Microsoft, where you actually can establish security and better configuration and so on. We're just talking about just basic RDP being installed on a machine and left open for someone to access. And there are still plenty of organizations that do that. As a matter of fact, there was a survey that RealVNC did, and it'll be published out very quickly, very soon. It's going to be called the 2026 Remote Access Trends Report, and there was a question about the current use of the remote desktop protocol specifically, and there was 40% said only used internally, it's not exposed to the internet. 30% said they do it via VPN or gateway, which again means it's not exposed to the internet. You have to use a VPN or a gateway to get in. 15% didn't use RDP, and then 10% still has an internet exposed. So that's a little bit of troublesome there. And in this idea around asking, why is it come used for attackers? I think there's an interesting way to look at this by looking at asking why customers use it, why organizations use it, and 58% of them said it's because it's just built in and there's legacy compatibility. Yeah. It's the same exact thing for threat actors. They're going, yeah, it's legacy, it's built in, I don't have to worry about it. So kind of interesting there. So RDP obviously continues to be used to some degree within organizations, kind of in a constant basis in business environments, despite the security issues that exist with it. But let's talk about those issues a little bit. What are the inherent vulnerabilities in RDP that make it what you think is a risky choice for businesses today?
Yeah, I suppose it is that ubiquity, isn't it, that makes it risky, because it becomes such a big target. A lot of people focused on it, trying to figure out how do we break this, either through actual, worm-enabled vulnerabilities or via other common security flaws in the configurations, things like that. But the fundamentals that historically have been a problem with it are it needs an open port. So, even if you're aware of that, you're going to have some other mechanism there to protect that if it's going to be on all the time, or if it's going to be, when it's on. So maybe a VPN, something like that. Or maybe you just don't have it externally accessible, but we've already discussed, that's not necessarily going to be a great story if someone does get access some other way. And I think, so the configuration of it is a weak point. I think it's all very well saying, you can lock it down in this way and that way. I'm not 100% sure that it's actually secure by default, and it's probably quite easy to make it insecure by fairly minor changes. Users, if they've got privileged access to their own machine, they may well enable it and leave it enabled by accident. So it's kind of like, it's almost like giving people enough rope to hang themselves, really, with the way it's there available. So it relies on a lot of things lining up to make it secure, whereas it should be the other way around. It should be relying on a lot of things lining up to make it insecure. But I think you've got to have the right password policies. You've got to make use of the right encryption standards with it. It used to have, I think it was RC4 encryption, which is no longer anything like state of the art. It's got these well-known ports. So all of those things are the defaults. And if we can do the opposite and line up positive things as the defaults, then it's much harder to to have it seen as a dangerous tool.
Yeah, just diving in maybe even a little bit deeper from a technical standpoint.
Yeah.
Why do you think RDP isn't built to handle the current threat landscape? Again, I've got some sort of high level, not technical answers here, but I want to talk about this from a technical perspective, and I'm going to kind of bring it back after that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of my points on this are probably fairly high level and non-technical too, but it's for similar reasons to that VNC open source is not built to handle the current threat landscape, not built to handle the internet, because these things were built at the point at which those technologies were becoming a thing. There wasn't really an internet when VNC started, and there wasn't much of an internet when RDP was going on. And even more than that, there wasn't really a threat out there as much as there is now. So they were both technology designed for the LAN. So a lot of at least in the open source VNC, a lot of the stuff that needs to be done to secure it isn't built in, as I said before. It's kind of stuff that you need to make sure you've done. It's not there by default. You have to add external mechanisms, either in Windows or in separate solutions. So it's really not there. So you need to add your own. You need to make sure you've got the right encryption. You need to add your own port security. You need to maybe add multi-factor authentication or I think for RDP, you can add network level authentication. So you need to add these things. You need to bring them yourself. So it's just not built for this landscape by default.
Yeah, I always think of it this way. Microsoft is a platform company. They're not an individual solution company.
Yeah.
They try to build big platforms, things that people can then build their solutions on, run their businesses on, and so on. And so that is to say they're not in the business of like remote desktop. It's not what they do
Yeah.
for a living. And to your point, they made this thing a long time ago. It's something like 20 years ago. We can run with that as a good estimate for the moment. Um, and it was built again, like you said, at a time where productivity was the name of the game. That's all we cared about then was productivity, because we still live within the four walls of our network. People were not accessing our network, maybe except for like needing a firewall, and that's about it to block certain things. But and then Microsoft also, because they're a platform company, they have traditionally left lots and lots of gaps on purpose for their partners, for their massive partner network to go build solutions that work with their platforms, if you will. And so they're basically going, yeah, it existed and we have it there and it's still on Windows. But if you really want something, excuse me, you're going to have to go to a third party, or of course, Microsoft did create remote desktop services, and that does add on some layers of security and provide some ability to centralize the deployment and configuration and so on. But RDP itself is just, I for the most part, my sense of it is from talking to IT professionals and organizations is they're not using remote desktop services. They would go get something else because they're thinking about wanting to cross to other types of different operating systems or devices and so on. And we'll talk more about that a little later on today. But yeah, that kind of thing kind of is my sense here. So going back to this idea of, okay, it's a viable solution, definitely adds productivity, was not designed around security. And the question is, why do you think it's still widely used despite, I don't want to say it's known vulnerabilities, because it doesn't have known vulnerabilities, but it's despite its insecurity, its current state of insecurity, to whatever degree that is. Why do you think it's so widely used?
I mean, I think it doesn't have known vulnerabilities right now, but it has had very recently. But I think it's partly this kind of inertia because it's there. People have used it for ages. People are used to it. Maybe it's just you've got a use case where it's kind of vital, maybe, and no one's really thought about changing it because it's built in. It's free. You don't need to do anything else. So it's that sort of legacy thing. It's ubiquitous. So if you're using Windows, you're mostly using Windows, and even with some of the open source, clients for Linux and Mac, you could easily see that someone would just use it for convenience, really.
Yeah, again, back to the forthcoming 2026 Remote Access Trends report that RealVNC is going to put out. I mentioned already 58% of people say they're using it because it's built-in, legacy compatibility, which makes sense. It's ease of use. And then there's 38% said cost, which I laugh. I know that somebody on like the RealVNC side wrote the question, but it's funny to go cost. It's free. There's no cost. But anyways, cost and licensing simplicity. And then there was another interesting question where it was like, what are your plans to do with it? And I'm just going to focus on one answer. Almost a third, 31%, said they have no plans to change, which means they're going to, back to the question I asked you earlier, like, why do you think that's still widely used? They're going to continue to widely use it. 31% of organizations here. So let's talk about maybe some of the practical issues you mentioned, like how RDP had some vulnerabilities of late and so on. Do you now have some examples maybe where RDP's caused a significant security issue for organizations? I obviously point out from a data point, like the Coveware data that says remote access in general, not RDP specifically, but definitely lateral movement, definitely initial access. So we know that it's participating, but do any of that's caused, where RDP itself caused significant security issues for an organization?
Yeah, I mean, a really big example, especially here in the UK, and actually I think it was worldwide, was WannaCry. It wasn't strictly RDP only, but it was caused by worms that could affect RDP and SMB, and that involved RDP at various stages, and it knocked out things like NHS systems. It knocked out really major organizations who are reliant on this technology, and I think caused a shift in thinking about how you use default stuff on Windows, things that everyone's been using forever, and are enabled on and sometimes exposed to the wider internet. So hopefully that was a wake up call. That was I think like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. And we've also had Blue Keep, which I believe was entirely an RDP vulnerability over the last few years. And again, it's just because it's there. It's widely used in these attacks, and either as a way in because someone's got a weak password, or there's a vulnerability like Blue Keep, or it just becomes a way to traverse the networks once inside. So, yeah, I think that many organizations, larger organizations, have felt the impacts of issues with RDP over the last, let's say, 5 years.
And maybe we talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you've encountered with customers, whether what kind of challenges their IT teams have faced when they try to secure RDP. I'm thinking about like a multi-platform environment. Maybe they have obviously multiple devices, and we already know right there's a non-starter by saying RDP itself doesn't work on every device. You don't have it for
Yep.
every kind of device. You don't have a Raspberry Pi RDP and so on and so forth. But what are the biggest challenges that IT teams have faced when they try to secure RDP?
It's the same sorts of things that I was saying before about this kind of the lining up of issues, and in this case, it's the lining up of the defaults, not being secure by default. So it's configuration, enforcing the use of a VPN, and maybe thinking about what ports you need it to be exposed on. If you're going to go that way, making sure everyone's got strong passwords in your infrastructure, and then mandating things like multi-factor authentication, network level authentication, and then the other big thing, which stems from just the ubiquity and the attacks we were just talking about, is just keeping up to date and patched with the latest vulnerabilities. And I think we've had at least 3 high severity CVEs in this last year. So you need to be really on top of that, I think, for something so targeted as RDP.
I'll also add another challenge that comes from the security side. So not so much IT teams, but security teams is just the lack of visibility into
Yeah,
when it's being used, how it's being used, what actions were taken. Those kinds of things where there's no accountability that exists, or
yeah,
auditability. And that is obviously very important. You've talked about SIEM solutions a number of times, whether it's a SIEM solution, but I think the SIEM solution, if nothing else, represents, there's a central ability to review actions, behavior, to try to decipher intent, whatever the
yeah.
case is, and just that this sort of lacks with RDP in and of itself.
Yeah, it's in the auditing of it, and also in how is it set up, how is it how is it configured on every single device. It's not necessarily something that people immediately have access to in an IT team.
Yep. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about RealVNC Connect. Um, Obviously, try to keep it as discussion-ish as possible and not pitchy. Although you're a developer, I don't think you're going to really be pitching a whole lot, anyways, which is good. So our audience can like sit back, and you're not going to be, "It's amazing, you should buy it now. Get your credit card," because they don't want to listen to that, and that's fine. But let's talk about in this same kind of line of thinking, all the stuff we've been talking about RDP. But then applying it to RealVNC Connect. What makes RealVNC Connect a better fit for today's IT environments compared to RDP, from like a security standpoint?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are loads of reasons. Putting my sales hat on, loads of reasons that aren't security related. But yeah, I mean, actually, just one thing from that pile of really good reasons to use Connect is that we're actually, for most use cases, we're accessing the console rather than a virtual desktop with an RDP, which is kind of more useful in many cases for IT support, especially. But yeah, I mean, RealVNC, because it grew out of VNC, it was the same original creators of VNC, and we have some of the same legacy issues, or we had some of the same legacy issues. But RealVNC's reason for existing was to create like an enterprise version of the insecure open source VNC, and do a kind of ground up rewrite of that with modern end-to-end encryption and the enterprise authentication, multi-factor authentication, all that stuff all built in. So I think that just that rewrite, that ground up rewrite, makes it a much better fit. It's targeted at that sort of use case. It's since those early days of real VNC and having the basics of enterprise stuff like the encryption. We've also added things like cloud brokered connections, which really resolve that issue of what are we opening up to the internet. You don't need to maintain an open port on each machine any longer, and you can control that, audit that through our portal. You can take a look at exactly which users have done what, and you can give those users permissions based on their roles as well. So I think it's just a world apart in terms of the intent behind what we've built. Is much more aimed at the enterprise there.
And you obviously talked about it a number of times in this last answer about it being this sort of an enterprise version based on the original protocol. How do you think RealVNC Connect's design tries to address those challenges, like the modern mixed IT environments? How are you addressing those challenges?
Yeah. Well, I mean, VNC's always been really highly cross-platform. It's always been like a really lightweight, highly scalable, adaptive protocol that's aimed at it's aimed at getting pixels from one screen to another as efficiently as possible and in a lightweight way as possible. And I think we've kept that fundamental ethos throughout. We've not drifted too far from that original world. So you can still use this one solution, this one real VNC solution with viewers and servers all combined, if you prefer, for a wide range of uses and a wide range of devices, more importantly. But yeah, so it really does scale quite nicely for whatever you're trying to do with it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of vendor lock-in and avoiding that. There was some data points in the report here where I'm going to see if I can find this real quick. I'm cheating and looking at my notes here. Talked about no plans to change, but there was a note I remember seeing in here that there was something about vendor lock-in that they liked and got away from. Where was that at? Oh, does RDP create vendor lock-in? And 48% said they agreed. I'm not really sure I agree with all those agrees because it's a free product. You're not locked into anything. It's not like you paid it and you have a license for 3 years, or whatever. But it does add to the whole, like, you're going to stay with Microsoft.
Yeah.
But I think to your point, when you talk about, RealVNC Connect helping scale an organization, it certainly does start meeting the needs around okay, we don't just have Windows machines. We have some Macs, we have other kinds of mobile devices, and we have other kinds of IoT devices. All those things we need to somehow remotely access and support. And therein lies the entirety of what IT is expected to take care of. And so let's just talk about it from a standpoint, though, because if they use a solution like RealVNC Connect, how does RealVNC help businesses avoid vendor lock-in? How does it improve interoperability between platforms? What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've always been a cross-platform, platform agnostic bit of software solution, and we're still interoperable with the Open VNC standards. So if you really needed to, support those as well, you can do that. So we're not forcing people into a particular OS ecosystem, and I think the sort of benefit of being able to manage all of those devices that you might have, and also the devices you might have in the future as well. So you may be a Windows house right now, but things change. You might need to have remote support to your customers, or sorry, your staff's iPhones or your staff's Android devices as well. And RealVNC allows that to be all conducted from one solution. You don't have to. Oh, we're connecting to a Windows machine here. We need to use RDP. We're connecting to a Linux, so let's use VNC or whatever. That I think that really does avoid any kind of at least OS vendor lock-in. Yeah.
And I want to shift to a slightly different line of questions, just really focusing on kind of the future a little bit here. And then we can start with maybe what are the must-have features for a secure remote access solution as we look into 2026?
Yeah, I think for me, it's going to be a bit of a retread of some of the stuff I've already said, probably said in many of our conversations. But I think it's you have to choose a solution that, if you want security, that doesn't trust the environment in which it's connecting. And this has been a failing of not just solutions that don't have cryptography, but solutions that don't have end-to-end cryptography. Maybe they have a jumping off point that's actually in the cloud somewhere, and they enables nice functionality, maybe, but it's a point of vulnerability for you, because whatever solution you've bought needs to be, absolutely secure forever, basically. And these sorts of non-end-to-end encrypted solutions just aren't good enough, really. And I think not directly exposing anything to the internet would be a good way to proceed as well. So some form of cloud brokering, but not cloud brokering that the clients making the connection have to trust in any way beyond just allowing them to make the connection. And then I think the final must-have that's just growing, all the time right now is this management side of it. Knowing what's going on with your solution, knowing who's using it, how they're using it, auditing it, repudiation, making sure that you can see what's gone wrong if something has gone wrong, and react to it really quickly. So it's that sort of auditability, I suppose.
Yeah, I see it as two parts. The first part is being able to granularly define what people can do so that privilege
Yeah,
doesn't get misused, privilege isn't needlessly granted. And that can be things from like, who can actually remote access this particular system in the first place, and then also defining whether or not they can exercise elevated privileges across that connection, things like that. And that's sort of the proactive, get it all set up properly side. And then the other side is the thing you just mentioned, which is the after the fact. Okay, do we have
yeah,
visibility? Can we actually see what people did, and so on? In the spirit of the conversation today, what are some of the things you think that IT teams, like, what are the key questions they should be asking when they're evaluating a remote access solution?
yeah. The key one obviously is, can it support what you need it to do? Does it support your use case? Does it scale? Does it support the range of platforms you need, now and in the future, like we said? Does it support the industry compliance that you need for your use case? But I would say, going back to the how are connections made? If connections are made via some sort of cloud service that is actually not end-to-end encrypted, then what is the solution's track record about breaches and vulnerabilities? And if that solution is breached, hacked, does that also expose your users to that hacker? I think you need to know how that all fits together, and really see the track record of that solution that you're buying into. Because, as I said much earlier on, this is giving you the keys to your infrastructure, to your front door, essentially. And then, can it integrate with stuff that you need it to integrate with? I guess that falls onto the use case. But does it have Entra support, maybe Okta, so you can federate the user's access to your solution, to how you're already managing them, basically. So that's kind of an ease of use thing for IT teams.
Yeah, I like any time that IT is thinking about implementing some either a replacement for an existing set of solutions or putting some new kind of solution in place. We have historically, I call it running home to mama, and that is we see a cool, shiny new solution and think, oh, that is so cool. And then we try to mash it into the organization and make it fit the business needs. And instead of talking about questions, I just think those of you that are listening, you think about your business requirements from a couple perspectives: the productivity requirements that you have for remote access solutions.
Yeah,
Think about the manageability requirements that you have for remote access solutions, and then specifically the security requirements. Dom, you mentioned things like, what kind of encryption does it support? Or does it support Entra ID? And those are tactical, in the weeds kind of things. Yes, they're all important too, but it might also be thinking about what your security goals are for an organization as a whole. And
yeah,
maybe you're doing things like least privilege, if not zero access, if not just in time access, those kinds of things. And you go, okay, how close to that can we get with a remote access solution. And you may not find any solution that actually does, let's say, just-in-time access and things like that. But the whole point being just you have at least your goals, and then you go and you evaluate a solution against the objectives that you have, the requirements, that you have there. Let me shift gears and talk about two other questions about RealVNC Connect here that I have. And the first one is just how does maybe it's the solution and or just RealVNC themselves as an organization ensure that that RealVNC Connect meets the needs of enterprises while staying secure and flexible? Is it, this could be a development answer, this could be just business goals, and but how does RealVNC make sure that the solution does that?
Yeah, the basics of that are the secured cloud connections, not needing a VPN to marshal the two endpoints that you're connecting. We're adding in the role-based access and auditing and policy enforcement. Those all things I think they're just fundamental to being secure and flexible about it. And we're a highly scalable, we have a highly scalable cloud solution. So, if your business is growing, then I think we've got a lot of room to provide for cloud connectivity there. But then the actual needs of enterprises tend to be involved in things like what sorts of compliance they need to address within the organization and within their customers' use cases. So we've addressed a lot of those with things like HIPAA compliance. ISO 27001 is something that we've adopted and become accredited for. So yeah, part of our software development lifecycle is all confirmed and audited by ISO 27001. Excuse me, ISO 27001. So yeah, I think we meet that.
And then you mentioned the cloud solution kind of being the key here for a lot of the scalability and long-term flexibility of the solution. Does that same answer resonate if I was to say, how does it simplify deployment and management for enterprise?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so if we were still a sort of point-to-point mechanism, a bit like RDP, then everything of the sort that you need for deployment and management of your IT system would be down to you as an IT team. So you would have to figure out how you're authenticating users to devices. You'd have to think about having new users for these connections that are separate from your Entra or your Okta, whatever your user management system is. You'd have to think about, how are we auditing this stuff? Maybe build your own kind of interface to the logging that you might be able to get out of your remote access solution. But being a cloud-based provider means that although our endpoints connect via the cloud, they don't trust it, but it does mean that we have some information about how that connection is working. We have the ability to integrate with Entra and integrate with Okta and manage those users that have access to those systems and apply all that stuff to really just simplify that whole thing. And then there's more basic stuff like, you can use MSIs to do mass deployment. You can use policy templates to make sure things are locked down in the way you want them to be. And even more basic stuff like you can choose to install a viewer on this device and a server on this device, or both if you need it. So the endpoint software is flexible enough that it makes that hopefully quite simple to get up and running with.
And just to kind of sum things up, last question here: is there like a piece of advice or one last note you'd like to leave with the audience, just to you give these IT professionals that are evaluating remote access as they go into 2026?
Look at your vendor's track record. Like I said before, I think that's really key. Look at their track record with hacks and vulnerabilities and how are they open about those things? What's their approach? Hopefully everyone is these days, because it's not tenable to keep these things hidden any longer. And look for I keep saying it, but look for a solution that doesn't trust the environment in which it's connecting. I think that's just vital these days. It's not useful or acceptable to have a solution that relies on some kind of either broken encryption between endpoints or no encryption at all. And look for the standards that you need, the compliance and certification that you need. Look for that in your solution, and think about the total cost. So you mentioned that RDP is used because it's free, but there may well be hidden costs associated with that it might not be as extreme as a breach. It could just be the ongoing management of RDP or whichever solution you've chosen that is not there in the upfront cost, that you may actually not have to face if you took a solution from someone like us. Just like needing a VPN for your solution, that's an extra cost. Yeah.
Good conversation today, Dom. I'm glad we had a chance to do this. Thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah, that's all the time that we do have for today. For those of you listening, if you'd like more information on RealVNC Connect, you can visit realvnc.com. And remember, this is only the second episode in our second season of RealVNC's podcast series. So be on the lookout for future podcast episodes on your choice of podcast platform. And you can, of course, always visit realvnc.com/podcast. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.